Imagine a room with no windows. The air is still. The door is locked. Every sound feels louder than it should. Footsteps in the hallway. The metallic click of a lock. The quiet tension of waiting for someone who controls everything about your survival, your freedom, your safety, your next breath. And then something strange begins to happen. The person you fear the most becomes the person you watch the closest. Their moods become the weather of your inner world. If they raise their voice, your heart collapses inward. If they show a small gesture of kindness, a glass of water, a softer tone, relief floods through your body like sunlight breaking through clouds. And slowly, something unthinkable begins to grow. Gratitude, then sympathy. Sometimes, even loyalty. This is the terrifying paradox at the heart of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where victims of captivity, abuse, or coercive control begin to emotionally bond with the very people who threaten them. At first glance, it seems impossible. Why would someone feel affection toward the person causing them harm? Why would a hostage defend their captor? Why would someone stay loyal to an abuser? Why would fear slowly transform into something that looks almost like love? But when we examine the deeper architecture of the human mind, the ancient survival systems buried in our nervous system, the picture begins to change. Because the human brain is not built primarily for truth, it is built for survival, and sometimes survival demands something that looks like love. When the mind is trapped in an environment where danger and safety come from the same person, it faces an unbearable contradiction. The threat and the lifeline are the same. So, the psyche does something extraordinary. It begins to rearrange reality, not because the person is weak, but because the mind is trying to stay alive. Stockholm Syndrome is not a story about irrational loyalty. It is a story about the terrifying intelligence of the survival instinct. The term Stockholm Syndrome originated after the Norrmalmstorg robbery, when hostages held captive for 6 days in a Swedish bank began defending their captors and even resisted rescue attempts. Observers were stunned, but psychologists began to recognize something deeper. A survival adaptation emerging under extreme psychological pressure. At its core, Stockholm Syndrome is driven by 3 overlapping psychological mechanisms: trauma, bonding, attachment dysregulation, and the hypervigilant survival response. To understand the phenomenon, we have to understand how these systems interact. The first mechanism, trauma bonding, happens when cycles of harm are occasionally mixed with moments of kindness, relief, or emotional connection. Imagine the nervous system as a storm detector. When a person experiences prolonged threat, captivity, abuse, coercion, their body remains in a state of extreme alertness. But if the sword in that threat occasionally provides relief, the nervous system begins associating that person with both fear and safety. This creates an emotional loop: pain followed by relief, terror followed by comfort, threat followed by kindness. And paradoxically, the relief feels so powerful that it strengthens the emotional attachment. Psychologically, this works through the brain's reward system. Dopamine spikes during moments of relief, reinforcing the bond. The brain begins whispering a dangerous story. If they can hurt me, but they also spare me, maybe they care. This is not love, but biologically, it can feel very close. The second mechanism lies in our deepest relational wiring: attachment dysregulation. Humans are born helpless. Our survival depends on bonding with caregivers. Even when caregivers are inconsistent or frightening, children often remain attached to them because attachment itself is a survival necessity. Psychologists call this disorganized attachment. The person who causes fear is also the person who provides safety. When this pattern appears in adulthood, during captivity, abusive relationships, or coercive environments, the brain may fall back into this early attachment strategy. The victim becomes emotionally attached to the source of danger because their nervous system cannot tolerate total isolation. Connection, even distorted connection, feels safer than emotional abandonment. The third component is hypervigilant survival response. In captivity or danger, the brain enters a state of extreme monitoring. Every facial expression, every tone of voice, every shift in mood. The victim studies their captor the way ancient humans studied predators. But this intense observation can also create something unexpected: empathy. The victim begins understanding the captor's moods, vulnerabilities, even their humanity. The brain, searching desperately for safety, constructs a new narrative. If I understand them, maybe I can influence them. And that understanding sometimes evolves into emotional identification, not because the captor deserves compassion, but because empathy becomes a survival tool. In this sense, Stockholm Syndrome is not irrational. It is a neurobiological survival strategy under impossible conditions. But surviving this way comes at a psychological price, because when fear and attachment merge, the emotional landscape becomes profoundly confusing. Victims often carry a quiet, invisible grief. They remember the moments of terror, the threats, the control, the helplessness. But they also remember moments of connection, a conversation, a shared joke, a moment when the captor seemed almost human. And this contradiction creates an emotional fracture inside the psyche. How can someone be both monster and protector? How can the same person represent danger and relief? This internal conflict often leads to intense shame. Many survivors ask themselves, why did I feel sympathy for them? Why didn't I hate them completely? Why did part of me care? But this question misunderstands the situation entirely. Stockholm Syndrome is not a moral failure. It is the nervous system solving an impossible equation. Psychiatrist Judith Lewis Herman, a pioneer in trauma psychology, described this dynamic as the mind's attempt to maintain psychological coherence in conditions of domination. In simpler terms, when someone controls your life completely, your mind must find a way to coexist with them. Hatred alone becomes dangerous, but emotional connection can reduce risk. And so, the psyche builds a bridge between terror and attachment. Yet, after the danger ends, the mind must face the aftermath. Survivors may struggle with lingering empathy for the person who harmed them. They may question their own judgment. They may feel disoriented when trying to interpret future relationships. Because when survival required loyalty to danger, the boundaries between love and fear become blurred. The patterns behind Stockholm Syndrome don't always remain confined to captivity or extreme situations. In many cases, the same psychological dynamics appear in everyday relationships, especially those involving emotional manipulation or control. If these patterns resonate with you, it does not mean something is wrong with you. It means your mind learned powerful survival strategies. Here are some signs that trauma bond dynamics may still be influencing your relational world. You are clinging to emotionally inconsistent people. You might find yourself drawn to people who are warm one moment, distant the next. The unpredictability creates emotional tension, but when they show affection again, the relief feels intensely rewarding. Your nervous system remembers that cycle. You're rationalizing harmful behavior. You might frequently find yourself explaining away someone's cruelty or manipulation. They didn't mean it. They're just stressed. They're actually a good person deep down. Your mind searches for reasons to preserve the bond. You overvalue small acts of kindness. A brief moment of warmth from someone who often hurts you may feel disproportionately meaningful. A compliment, a gentle gesture, a moment of attention. Because your nervous system associates those moments with emotional relief, you have difficulty leaving harmful situations. Even when you intellectually recognize that a relationship is damaging, leaving can feel terrifying. Not because you are weak, but because your brain associates that bond with survival. You're suppressing your own needs. You may unconsciously prioritize the other person's emotional state over your own, monitoring their moods, avoiding conflict, trying to maintain peace at the cost of your own voice. Your anxiety is heightened in emotional ambiguity. When someone becomes quiet or distant, your mind may immediately begin scanning for danger. Your nervous system learned that emotional shifts could signal threat. You feel responsible for another person's behavior. You may believe that if you just say the right thing, behave the right way, anticipate their emotions perfectly, you can prevent conflict or harm. This is a survival pattern, a deeply intelligent one, but one that can trap people in cycles of emotional self-abandonment. You're confusing intensity with love. Perhaps the most subtle sign. Relationships filled with emotional volatility may feel strangely familiar. Calm, stable connections can feel almost boring. Not because stability lacks value, but because your nervous system learned to associate love with emotional survival. When people first hear about Stockholm Syndrome, the reaction is almost always the same: confusion, disbelief, sometimes even judgment. From the outside, it seems impossible to understand. How could someone sympathize with the person holding them captive? How could fear evolve into loyalty? But the deeper you look into the architecture of the human mind, the clearer something becomes. Stockholm Syndrome is not a psychological failure. It is a survival adaptation. When a human being is placed in a situation of total dependency, where the same person controls both the threat and the possibility of safety, the brain faces a terrifying dilemma. If the captor is purely the enemy, the situation becomes hopeless. But if the captor can be perceived as human, even compassionate in small ways, the mind suddenly finds something crucial: possibility. The possibility of mercy, the possibility of negotiation, the possibility of survival. And so, the psyche begins to perform one of its most remarkable operations. It begins rewriting the narrative. Small gestures are magnified. Moments of restraint feel like acts of kindness. A captor who doesn't harm you when they easily could begins to appear almost protective. The brain quietly shifts its interpretation of reality, not because the victim is naive, but because hope becomes a psychological necessity. The nervous system cannot survive indefinitely in pure terror. It needs moments of relief. And when those moments come from the very person who holds the power of life and death, the brain does something extraordinary. It builds an emotional bridge. This is the dark intelligence of survival, because in extreme conditions, hatred alone is dangerous. Hatred provokes. Hatred escalates tension. But empathy, even distorted empathy, can soften the atmosphere of captivity. Empathy can reduce violence. Empathy can buy time. And time, in situations like that, can mean everything. From a purely evolutionary perspective, this makes disturbing sense. For thousands of years, humans survived not only by fighting threats, but by adapting to them. Sometimes survival meant escaping, sometimes it meant hiding, and sometimes it meant forming fragile psychological alliances with the very forces that threatened you. The brain is not loyal to truth, it is loyal to continuation. And this is why Stockholm Syndrome unsettles people so deeply, because it forces us to confront a difficult reality about the human psyche. Under the right pressure, our perceptions are not as stable as we think. Our loyalties are not as fixed as we imagine. Place someone in an environment of isolation, fear, and dependence long enough, and the mind will begin searching for ways to make the unbearable bearable, even if that means forming a bond with the cage itself. And maybe that is the most haunting realization of all. Stockholm Syndrome isn't just about hostages in bank vaults or kidnapping victims in locked rooms. It is a window into the incredible flexibility of the human survival instinct, the ability of the mind to reshape emotion, perception, and meaning in order to stay alive. Because in the end, the brain has only one priority, not justice, not truth, not even dignity. Survival. It will bend perception. It will reinterpret danger. It will even transform fear into something that resembles loyalty. Not because the captor deserves it, but because survival sometimes demands a different story. And that is the unsettling truth behind Stockholm Syndrome. It isn't proof that the victim was weak. It's proof that the mind will do almost anything to stay alive, even if survival requires bending reality, redefining loyalty, and slowly turning the cage into something that almost feels like home. Because in the end, the human brain has only one rule: survive first, understand later. And sometimes, survival means learning how to love the cage,